My son told me he is a serial killer, and I believe him. People always look at me strangely when I tell them my son is 18 and I'm 33. When James and I go somewhere together, people often ask if he's my younger brother. These 18 years haven't been easy, but I like to think I did everything I possibly could, given the circumstances. When I was still in high school, my girlfriend got pregnant. Her parents wanted to give the baby up for adoption, but my mom stepped in and helped me fight for custody. My son turned out great. He's an honor student and the starting point guard on his high school basketball team. I even managed to save enough money to buy him a reasonably decent car. He's popular at school, which is something I never was. When I was his age, I already had a 2-year-old son, a high school diploma, and a full-time job at the local Pella factory. We live in a small 2-bedroom duplex just a few blocks from his school. He does his homework without reminders and spends most of his free time either with friends or in the living room, absolutely destroying me in Call of Duty. At one point, I wondered if maybe he was into guys. I honestly wouldn't have cared, but it felt strange that a kid his age had never dated a girl. When I finally asked him about it, he smiled and said, "No, Dad, I just want to wait a bit before starting relationships. I don't want you becoming a grandpa in your early 30s. That pretty much ended our talk about the birds and the bees. Between the internet and the sex ed classes I signed permission slips for, I figured he knew the basics. A few months ago, he told me he'd be staying out late. When I asked why, he said he had a date. I didn't ask any follow-up questions. I slipped $100 into his hand and told him to be home by breakfast. He was a good kid. I trusted him. After that, it started happening from time to time. Friday afternoons he'd warn me he'd be out late. Every Saturday morning, I'd find him sitting on the couch playing Xbox. I never met any of his girlfriends, but I assumed he just didn't want to introduce them to me. Like I said, I trusted my son. He was smart, and I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. I don't usually watch the news. I just scroll through social media, and that's enough for me. But for some reason, around 5 in the evening, I found myself standing in front of the TV and decided to turn the news on. I regret doing that. The commercials ended, and the screen switched to a news anchor sitting there with a grim expression on her face. She looked straight into the camera and said, "Several women in the county are still reported missing. Police are searching for evidence to determine whether these disappearances are connected. We lived in a quiet, small town. The idea that something like this could be happening so close to home unsettled me deeply. The thought that my son could be out late at night scared me even more. I talked to him about it. He told me not to worry. James was a big kid, nearly 6.5 feet tall, broad-shouldered, solid. I wasn't afraid someone could overpower him. But having been a big guy myself, I knew size doesn't mean much when someone has a gun. James reassured me that I had nothing to worry about. Still, just to be safe, I took his phone one night while he was asleep. I installed an app that allowed me to see his location at any time. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I remembered being 17 and feeling completely invincible. I didn't think about it for long. I set the app to hidden mode and put his phone back on the kitchen charger. I figured that if I ever got worried while he was out, I'd just open the app on my phone, check where he was, calm myself down, and go back to watching Netflix. Around that time, I started following the case of the missing women online. In our county, it was slowly turning into a full-blown media sensation. Over the course of 10 weeks, 6 women disappeared. They were all different ages, different appearances. No bodies had been found, but police were working under the assumption that murder was involved. When a 7th woman went missing, my heart dropped. I hadn't seen Rochelle in 10 years. She re-entered our lives when James was about 7. She tried to play the role of a mother, but she failed. After several months of empty conversations and missed visits, I filed a motion in court requesting a substance test. When she failed it, my lawyer filed another motion that stripped her of all visitation rights to our son. I didn't want him going through that again. It was a Saturday morning, and I reluctantly dragged myself downstairs. James and I rarely talked about his mother. After his birth, she completely spiraled and started using whatever substances she could trade her body for. By the time she decided to visit him again, she had aged at least 20 years in just 7. Her arms were covered in needle marks, and her teeth were black and rotting. Honestly, I was surprised she had lived that long at all. With a heavy heart, I approached my son in the living room and said, "Son, we need to talk about your mother." James sighed, paused his game, looked up at me, and asked, "What did she do this time?" I took a breath and said, "She went missing last night. The police say there were signs of a struggle in her trailer." James stared at the TV as if he was looking through it, and then paused the game. Without turning to me, he said, "That's not really news, is it?" We avoided talking about his mother because he hated it. One of the main reasons I involved a lawyer back then was because during one of her visits, she took him with her. While he sat on the couch, several clients came by. During his first real visit with her, addicts sat next to him, paying $20 to be with his mother. After 3 hours, a man James called Stephen drove him home. When I got back from work, he was sitting outside. When I asked what happened, all he said was that his mother didn't want him coming over anymore. He sat outside without a jacket for 4 hours. A lot worse could have happened to him while he was with her, so I was relieved it ended as lightly as it did. I'd heard horrifying stories about similar situations that ended far more tragically. After that, I immediately put James into therapy. Over the years, his emotional state stabilized, and the visits became less frequent. Up until that night, he asked about his mother once every couple of months. Since then, it felt like he mentioned her only one more time. The following week, he told me he was going on another date. That night, all the anxiety I'd been building up finally pushed me to open the app on my phone. He drove to a random address across town, and then far out into the middle of nowhere. I had installed the app weeks earlier and hadn't thought much about it. I didn't realize it had been saving all of his location data the entire time. According to the records, over the next 6 weeks, he visited that remote area at least 4 times. When I checked the timeline, I noticed that on the night Rochelle disappeared, he was at her trailer. I felt sick to my stomach, but I refused to believe what would have been obvious if it were anyone else's son. I tossed my phone onto the bed and pulled a bottle of whiskey from my nightstand. I drank until I blacked out and woke up the next morning completely destroyed. James was downstairs playing Dark Souls. I slammed a can of Red Bull and staggered out to my car. I decided to drive out there and see where my son had been taking these girls on their dates. I wish I hadn't gone. I truly do. The GPS led me down a gravel road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I drove maybe 200 meters before thick forest closed in on both sides. Eventually, the road opened into a small clearing with a pond in the middle. I stopped the car, shut off the engine, and stepped out. Near the water, I noticed the remains of a fire pit. I walked closer. The ashes were still warm. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My son had found a quiet spot in the middle of nowhere, a pond under the stars, a place to impress girls. For a moment, I was almost proud of him. That feeling didn't last long. I noticed marks in the dirt leading toward the pond. It looked like something heavy had been dragged across the ground straight into the water. I walked to the edge and stared down into the murky surface. When I turned back toward the fire pit, I saw dark stains in the grass behind me. Blood. With shaking legs, I stepped into the water. About 10 feet from the shore, my foot hit something solid. I bent down, reaching blindly. My hand closed around thick metal links of a heavy industrial chain. I pulled on it, and something wrapped in a blanket slowly emerged from the water. I peeled the fabric back just enough to see her face. Swollen, pale. It was Rochelle. I wrapped her back up immediately and pushed her deeper under the surface. Then I ran. I sprinted back to my car and drove home like I was being chased. I sat in the driver's seat in my driveway for 15 minutes, trying to figure out whether I was having a panic attack or a heart attack. My chest hurt so badly it felt like it might burst. Tears streamed down my face as I desperately tried to come up with explanations, conspiracies, coincidences, anything that meant my son wasn't responsible. Someone knocked on my driver's side window, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was James. I stepped out of the car on unsteady legs. He immediately hugged me and said, "Whatever it is, Dad, it's okay. Just tell me what happened. He was such a good son." For a moment, I forgot about the pond, the chain, and his mother's body. I followed him inside, changed into dry clothes, and joined him in the living room. I sat in my chair, and he sat across from me on the couch. We were silent for several minutes before I finally said, "I found your mother." I don't know what I expected, but his reaction shocked me. There was no surprise, no anger, just that same flat, emotionless expression I had seen on his face in rare moments when I caught him doing something he knew he shouldn't. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Tell me you didn't do anything stupid, son." He looked away and asked, "What do you mean by stupid?" My voice rose despite myself. "God damn it, James. You killed your mother." He laughed. Then he said it. He told me she had been dead long before he hit her and dragged her into the car. Anyone willing to sell their own child for a fix, he said, had been dead inside for years. I couldn't speak. I had always wondered about that night, but James had never talked about it. Then he continued. He said he was lucky the man who paid for him had driven him home and told him never to come back. Things could have been much worse. But that was the day he broke. That was the day he realized how meaningless life really was. Of course he killed her. He said she deserved to die over and over again. My eyes filled with tears as my son calmly admitted to more than 15 murders. I sat there in shock, listening as he described everything in detail. When he finished, I just sat there. What could I say? What was I supposed to say? My son confessed that he was a serial killer, and the only thought running through my head was how to keep this from ruining his life. Eventually, I found the courage to speak. "We need to get you help, son. This isn't healthy." James interrupted me. "No therapist can help me, Dad. He told me I'd been a good father, so he'd spare me the unnecessary lies. We both knew he'd be turning 18 in a month. He said once that happened, he'd be leaving my house for good. He also said he had plans." I stared at my son, trying to see the monster he had become. For 17 years, I'd been his parent. Never, even in my worst nightmares, did I imagine he'd be this broken. About a week later, I quit my job. By the time his 18th birthday arrived, I had burned through most of my savings, drowning myself in alcohol, trying to forget what I knew. The day after his birthday, he disappeared. The last bit of hope I had left died a few weeks later when police pulled bodies from the pond. By then, he was already gone. A few weeks ago, I received a postcard. On the front was a picture of a sandy beach. On the back were the words, "Hi, Dad. Just wanted to let you know I'm okay." I dropped it on the table by the door and went back to the bottle. Part of me wants to go to the police and tell them everything. It probably wouldn't even be that hard to track him down. But he's still my son. I'm capable of a lot, but turning him in for crimes that would land him on death row is beyond my sense of responsibility. Every week, the guilt gets heavier. All I can do now is hope that he's actually okay. I have no idea where he is, and I don't want to know. All I can hope for is that he's stopped killing. He really was a good kid at all, charismatic. I'm sure he could have achieved so much if he wanted to. Let me know in the comments if you like stories like this. Also tell me whether you prefer realistic stories or ones that are clearly fictional. Now let's move on to the next story. I served time with one of the most unknown serial killers in the world. Hello everyone. I'm a former inmate, not great with computers, but I stumbled across this site and enjoyed reading other people's stories. So I decided to share my own. I spent 10 years in prison, from 2001 to 2011, and I may have met the most unknown serial killer in the world. This was in 2011, when I had about 6 months left on my sentence. For obvious reasons, I won't use his real name. We shared a cell during those final months. He was in for fraud. 3 years, maybe more, I don't remember exactly. He was almost 60. And to put it simply, he didn't look like a typical inmate at all. Thin, glasses. Always carrying a book. During yard time, he constantly played chess. I heard he never lost a single match. At first, we didn't talk much, but after I told him I was getting out soon and complained about paperwork and how bad my writing was, he offered to help. I appreciated it, and after that we became friendlier with each other. The night before my release, he told me his story. I managed to get some homemade alcohol, and we started drinking and swapping stories like people do in prison, mostly exaggerations and bravado. I'll admit, we were pretty drunk. That's when he finally told me everything. At the time, just like you probably are right now, I thought it was complete nonsense. We were drunk, and I didn't believe a single word. I assumed it was the rambling of a madman. But after I got out, well, first I'll tell his story, then what I found out later. That night, he claimed that between 1970 and 2010, he killed 155 people. He said his first victim was when he was 23. But that he realized at 15 that this was what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. He described it as a calling, like becoming a priest. He said he specialized in highways and mostly interstates. He waited in roadside rest areas at night until someone pulled in. Fridays were his favorite, the easiest victims, like taking candy from a child. They would pass out in the driver's seat, trying to sleep off 10 beers before risking a drive and getting pulled over. He said he watched them sleep, heads tilted back, mouths open. Eventually, he said, drunk drivers became too easy, too boring. That's when he switched to couples. His favorites were college students, young, attractive, their whole lives ahead of them. He said he got the greatest satisfaction from taking away a life with that much potential. They'd pull into a rest stop to make out, and he'd watch them in the dark before approaching. Afterward, he recorded news broadcasts. There was always a smiling young blonde on the screen, then candlelight vigils, people saying they were grateful it wasn't them, grieving parents, teachers who barely knew the student, talking about her bright future, a future that would never happen. He organized those recordings into categories. In the evenings, he'd sit down with pizza and wine and rewatch his favorites like movies. Of course, I didn't believe him. Who would? We were drunk. And by then I felt sick just listening. I wanted to punch him, but I couldn't. I was getting released in the morning, and he knew it. Later, I realized that was exactly why he told me. The last part of his story is what stuck with me. In the 90s, a girl named Alicia was murdered. I won't say her full name, but you can Google it. The article will come up. It was a massive case in our country. That night, he said he killed her. He asked if I wanted to know where the body was buried. I told him he was a sick bastard. But he told me the location anyway. You should have seen the smile on his face. It was like he'd been playing with me the whole time, waiting for the night before my release to finally tell me everything to test me. The next morning, he stared at me with empty eyes as I walked out of the cell. I've spent my life around killers and criminals, but that look on his face was something else. Sometimes I still see those cold, dark eyes when I close mine. For 6 months after my release, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said about that murder, about the place he described. I caught myself late at night, searching the case online, comparing details with his story. It got so bad that I developed severe anxiety. Of course, I'll never go to the police. I'm old school. Still, it eats at me sometimes. I think he was lying, just trying to unload his mind onto someone. I enjoyed reading your stories, so I decided to share mine. I'm looking forward to more. It helps with anxiety. Thanks for reading, and God bless you. Now let's move on to the third story. I met a serial killer at a roadside gas station. This happened in the summer of 2006, when I was 20. I had just gotten my driver's license that January. Driving opened up so many possibilities that I often took solo road trips to visit friends in other states. I looked younger than my age, and people often mistook me for a high school student. One random day in July, I was driving alone towards southern Pennsylvania for a long weekend. My friend's parents were away, and the house was ours. We planned to drink, sit in the hot tub, get drunk watching Planet Earth. It had just come out, and maybe even run through cornfields at night. I was excited and enjoying the drive. The music was good. The weather was perfect. Right after crossing from New Jersey into Pennsylvania, I stopped at one of the first gas stations to fill up and grab snacks for the rest of the trip.